Everyone, I'm Robert George, McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, and former Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And it's my honor to welcome you today to this Fidelity Month presentation. By the power vested in me by absolutely no one, in the spring of last year, 2023, I declared June to be Fidelity Month. So this is our second year celebrating June as Fidelity Month. Why did I do that? Well, my reasons are really straightforward. There are certain values, certain beliefs, certain commitments that used to bind Americans together, despite our differences of race and ethnicity, cultural heritage, religion, background. And those values were not blood and soil or throne and altar. Those values were faith in God, belief in the importance of fidelity to one's spouse and to one's children, and belief in and love of one's country and community, and a commitment to service to the country and community who have given so much to us. These, in addition to our commitment to our constitutional principles, were what bound us together as a people. Despite those differences, we integrated ourselves around those shared commitments. Well, in the spring of last year, I saw some polling data which really shocked me. And that showed that Americans' belief in the importance of faith in God, in the importance of marriage and the family, in the importance of patriotism, love of country, had dramatically diminished. What had gone up, and the only thing that had gone up, was Americans' belief in the importance of money. So clearly something was off here, something was backwards. And it seemed to me that this diminution in support for our fundamental, constitutive, unifying values, the values that were at least the source of our unity and strength, had a lot to do with the maladies and the pathologies that we face today as Americans. And so my hope was that by rallying Americans in the month of June to rededicate themselves to the principles of fidelity, we could turn this country around. We could make America faithful again. And it caught on. With the help of my principal co-conspirator, Deacon Michael Forrest, we tried to create a fidelity movement with Fidelity Month in June as the centerpiece of the movement. And people all over the country joined us. So we're doing it again this year, and we're hoping to keep doing it indefinitely for as long as it takes to make America faithful again. And of course, that's a perennial challenge and a perpetual challenge. But we think it's important in this nation that is not built on commonality of blood and soil or throne or altar. We really do need those unifying values. Those values are critically important in themselves to the success of human lives, to our flourishing as human beings. And they are important to us as a people because they are our sources of unity and strength. So to help to introduce Fidelity Month for 2024, I'm delighted to be joined and very grateful to be joined by a most distinguished panel of presenters. First, I'll present my panelists in the order in which they'll speak. First is Ryan Anderson. Dr. Anderson is president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and one of our nation's leading public intellectuals. He's a graduate of Princeton University and holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Before taking over the leadership position at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the successor to the great Ed Whelan, Dr. Anderson was at the Heritage Foundation. And before that, he was at First Things Magazine, where he served under the legendary Father Richard John Newhouse. And before that, he served as research assistant to, well, me. He is the author of, or co-author of, important books on the sanctity of human life, on marriage and the family, and on religious liberty. His superb book on transgender ideology had the high honor of being banned by Amazon. Anna Samuel is academic director of the marriage movement, Cana Vox, of which she is the co-founder, and was the founding executive director of the Witherspoon Institute, of which she is now a research scholar. Anna, too, is a graduate of Princeton. I'm proud to claim her as my own student. And she, too, holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. Her summer seminars for high school students on Plato's Dialogues and Aristotle's moral philosophy, offered under the auspices of the Witherspoon Institute, have formed a virtual generation of young women as deep and critical thinkers on fundamental questions of virtue and human flourishing, the human good. And then batting third, Dr. Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation. Prior to taking the helm at Heritage, he led the Texas Public Policy Foundation and served as president of Wyoming Catholic College. Dr. Roberts is a graduate of the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. A former college history teacher, Dr. Roberts is also the founder of the Pope John Paul II, or Pope John Paul the Great Academy, which is a co-ed K-12 Catholic liberal arts school in Lafayette, Louisiana. To all of you, Dr. Samuel, Dr. Roberts, and Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining me. Let's begin with Ryan Anderson. Ryan?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Robbie. Thank you for the warm introduction for all three of us and for kicking off this entire month last year with the insight that you had to launch it. You asked me to speak about fidelity to God, the kind of first principle of Fidelity Month. And I think the first thing to say about fidelity to God is actually to reverse the order and speak of God's fidelity to us. I think it's important to highlight that God is the one who is faithful to us, even when we fall into infidelity towards him. I speak as a Catholic Christian, and what I see throughout both the Torah and the New Testament over and over again, it's man's unfaithfulness, man's lack of fidelity, and God's abundant fidelity. And what takes place during biblical time only continues to our day. And so just to start with that thought. Second thought is that, fidelity to God, when I was looking at the etymology of this, fidelity is faith. Faith is an infused virtue. It's a theological virtue. And so again, as a Catholic, I was like, oh, that's not so unifying, because that requires grace. That requires sanctifying grace. And so I thought a little more about this. And while Aquinas will talk about fidelity, talk about faithfulness as a theological virtue, one of the infused virtues, he speaks of religion in his treatise on the cardinal virtues. And it's there that he places it under the cardinal virtue of justice. And the person who Aquinas cites there, in addition to Augustine, is Cicero, the ancient Roman statesman and thinker, who had a profound influence on the American founding. And so you can see this as we think about how fidelity to God can unify our country. It's actually by seeing that the American founders were not a collection of Enlightenment rationalists, secularists, the way that they're sometimes portrayed. There's a deep understanding both of Protestant theology and of, I would say, philosophical theology. And where you see this, I think, best on display is in James Madison. And so it's appropriate, Robbie, you as the director, the founding director of the James Madison program at Princeton University, for me just to read a short snippet from Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, and contained it within here as a quotation from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. But what Madison writes, the time of the founding, he says, quote, "Because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. It is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right." He then goes on to explain why it's an unalienable right. And he says, this right, what is here a right towards man is a duty towards the Creator. It's the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. And I think that's a very helpful way for seeing how something that can unite us, something that can bind us. We are all creatures. We are all entirely dependent for our existence on the Creator. We each have duties to the Creator, and we each have to figure out for ourselves, based upon our conscientious best judgment, what we owe to the Creator. Now, I think this could at least this could help us in at least 4 ways as we think through how a renewal of our fidelity to God can unify our nation. And I just want to close by suggesting 4 kind of concrete ways that a return to fidelity to God can help us with our national unity. And the first is, Robbie, you had mentioned that my first boss after you was Father Richard John Newhouse, the founding editor of the journal First Things. And Newhouse always liked to say that the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. And so I think one of the ways in which a return to fidelity to God can help us is in the way in which we engage in politics and the public square. For too many people, politics has become their religion. Politics has become their God. By devoting ourselves, renewing ourselves to fidelity to God, we can place politics in its proper importance, which isn't to say that it isn't important, but it's a penultimate discipline. It's not a ultimate discipline. This can help us lower the stakes of politics. I think it could also help us lower the temperature. So the first thought is about the process of politics, but the second is the substance of our politics. Fidelity to God can help us in the crafting of our laws. We've seen these very odd mainstream media stories in the past year claiming that Christians who believe our rights come from God are engaged in some spooky form of Christian nationalism. There was this Political piece by Heidi Presblica, I think it was back in February, that she was doing this expose on this weird group of Americans who believe our rights come from God. This is part of the American creed. No less of a secular Enlightenment thinker than Jefferson, as he pens the Declaration of Independence, would say that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. America at her best has been vindicating this. Our greatest social reform movements. Take an example, Martin Luther King Jr. writing from the Birmingham prison. Who does he cite? He cites St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Explaining why an unjust law is no law at all, why the laws that we had on the books enforcing segregation, race-based discrimination, were unjust, right? So if fidelity to God can actually help us not only with the process of politics, but with the substance of politics, substance of our unity. And it just strikes me that today, when you combine what MLK was saying about unjust laws, about the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God, what Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration is saying about each and every one of us being made in the image and created equal and endowed by the Creator, echoing, as I almost went into the beginning of Genesis, being made in the image and likeness of God. It just strikes me that we're going to have to renew this is in defense of the equal dignity, the inherent worth of children in the womb, and then also a defense of the reality that we're created male and female, that these unjust laws, we can get better laws by renewing our fidelity to God. Third, it strikes me that we protect the liberties the most. We are most deliberate in protecting civil liberties that we ourselves exercise. And so I think one of the reasons that we have seen the decline in support for religious liberty and that we've seen the violations of religious liberty is precisely because of a decline in religious belief and religious practice. Many of these religious liberty battles have been some of the most divisive parts of our politics. The fact that the Little Sisters of the Poor had to sue the Obama administration because they were being forced to cover contraceptives that could kill unborn human beings. A return to fidelity to God can help us see the importance, the centrality of religion. We realize that Madison's argument, when he says it's the duty of each creature towards the Creator, that's his explanation for why religious liberty is a natural right, which should be a civil right, which should be a constitutional right. And then fourth and finally, it just strikes me that the deepest reason for renewing our fidelity to God isn't about how it's going to improve our politics or how it might help unify the nation, but because ultimately it's our final end. It's our happiness. And again, speaking as a Catholic, the kingdom of God is what life is ultimately all about. And the way that we become citizens of that kingdom is precisely by responding to God's grace, precisely by being faithful to God in response to his faithfulness to us.
Well, thank you very much for those insights. Anna, Dr. Anna Samuel, Anna, you have dedicated your own life not only to your marriage to Diego and your 6 beautiful children, but to defending the institution of marriage and to defending the family. Why don't you talk to us a bit about Fidelity Month and what it means to you?
Sure. Well, thank you, Robbie, for inviting me again to this second annual. You know, I'm a big fan of this project. So this year, as I was reflecting on Fidelity Month, my mind really went to the American dream. It's a concept that is very close to my heart because I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants. My parents came here from Mexico. My grandparents did as well. And faith and family and all the opportunities that are in this country really allowed me to be here on a webinar with these great men. And so I really wanted to reflect a little bit on the American dream and how faith and family play a role in that today. Because really every generation of Americans has had to articulate the American dream a little bit differently. And of course, it's this patriotic idea that every individual, regardless of background or circumstances of birth, has the opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work and determination. But over the generations, it has changed a little bit. Past ideals focused more on a dream of freedom from tyranny, right? Or having protection of individual liberties from another country, or as having economic opportunities. But today, I think that we are seeing a new version of the American dream coalesce before us. And it's a version that I think builds on the ideals of the past, but it champions a deeper appreciation of the role of faith and family. So let me just briefly talk a little bit about what this is and try to unpack the moment I think we are all in today. So the original version of the American dream was really about establishing a new social and political order, right? As we've said, as Robbie and Ryan have both said, the American founding was premised on this view of equality of birth, that we are all created equal, and unlike our European cousins, nobody here would be born into nobility by birth or circumstances to rule over other classes. On our land, we would have the same rights and responsibilities to pursue prosperity. Now, of course, it has always been a massive struggle to live up to this ideal. And we all know that our collective failures continue to haunt us to this day. But this original goal of securing equality and liberty for all was the right one. And the republic, the democratic republic chosen, was the correct political structure for the job. Now, later articulations of the American dream had to sort of change the tune a bit because history changed as well. I think especially of Franklin Roosevelt, who referred to the American dream in his New Deal speeches, which were aimed at economic recovery and social reform for all of those Americans before us who were suffering through the Great Depression. FDR marshaled the power of the federal government to play a bigger role in the advancement of individual prosperity for all people. And he really set up a precedent and a broad expectation that the government would bolster domestic prosperity for generations to come. President Reagan continued to build on this dream of economic prosperity, but he sought to curb some of the excesses of the state. And he encouraged individuals to focus on what they could do through hard work and determination, through thrift, personal initiative, all made possible by limited government and the economic opportunities of a free market. He was the son of an alcoholic shoe salesman, so President Reagan knew firsthand the hard work needed to rise to the top, first as an actor and then as our great president. And during the presidency of President Barack Obama, the American dream began to sound a little differently. In addition to the often heard messages of strengthening federal assistance to inner city communities and public schools, Obama spoke about the important role that families played in helping vulnerable citizens achieve the American dream. While speaking to a Chicago crowd one very sad afternoon in 2013, after a drive-by gang member had shot a little girl on the streets of Chicago, he said to the Americans then, "We all share a responsibility to move this country closer to our founding vision, that no matter who you are or where you come from, here in America, you can decide your own destiny. You can succeed if you work hard and fulfill your responsibilities. Now that starts at home. There's no more important ingredient for success, nothing that would be more important for reducing violence than strong, stable families, which means we should do more to promote marriage and encourage fatherhood." Of course, President Obama spoke from experience too, because he was raised by a single mother, and he knew the challenges that a child faces when he's not benefiting from the care of both his mother and father at home. In many ways, President Obama is an archetype for our age. In the last 6 decades of America, we've seen an unprecedented breakdown of marriage and family, and many voices have sounded the alarm about what the new data is saying about this ongoing state of affairs. Some very noteworthy voices include social scientists like Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, Professor Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas at Austin, Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and economist Melissa Kearney at the University of Maryland. They have all argued in their own ways that children really need a stable home with dedicated parents in order to enjoy the economic, emotional, social, and educational resources that the state just cannot provide. Aside from all this scholarship, we've heard a lot of personal testimonies in the last few years. I'm thinking especially of those like J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy, and Rob Henderson, his new book, Troubled, which powerfully convey how opportunity begins in the family. These courageous individuals have spoken very honestly about their lack of family structure as children and how difficult it has been for them to overcome the odds, even when they are offered state assistance and Ivy League educations and everything else. It turns out that all along our history, behind the Democratic Republic, behind the rule of law, the courts, the centralized bank, the dedicated police, behind the firemen and the free market and the public schools and the private schools and the baseball fields and the malls and everything else that we associate with the American dream, there was family and the church taking care of people's basic human needs so that they could profitably participate in all that our social order had to offer. So today, as we are increasingly losing our grip on family and faith, many of those social blessings are also beginning to recede. So what to do? Well, this is a massive problem, of course, but we can all personally recommit ourselves to faith and family and country. And I personally recommit myself today to fast with you all, to pray with you all for this. And I also encourage you to join whatever organization of your church or of your choice encourages these ideals. Certainly, you're most welcome to join Cana Vox. We form reading groups with our neighbors and our friends to study the importance of marriage and family and sexual integrity, all from the perspective of natural law and social science. But more pointedly, I think for today, I would also leave us with this idea, just one. I would ask everybody listening today to ask yourselves, are we doing all we can to prepare the next generation of citizens for marriage? As a parent, just like so many parents today, I also feel the great pressures that we feel to get our kids into good schools, on the best sports teams, into a decent crowd of friends, and in line to get all those academic achievements. And why? So that they can get into a good college and eventually have a great career. But how much time and energy and creativity and other resources do we expend helping our kids get ready to make wise marriage decisions? Do we talk to them about dating prudently? Are we offering them classes on how to be a good girlfriend or boyfriend, or how to grow up to be a good mother or father? I think that if we're all honest with ourselves, we know that our nation has a lot of work to do in this area. So that's what I think I would put some pressure. Because every generation has to struggle to preserve our American social order from whatever forces are seeking to undermine it. But I think the main priority right now in our day and age is to shore up the family and all those faith communities that sustain it. And I'm really confident that our civil society is up to the task. So let's continue our work and find new allies that can expand and reach. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anna. What a wonderful, beautiful presentation. So much profound truth there. Now over to Dr. Kevin Roberts. Patriotism, of all the traditional values and virtues, seems particularly to have taken a hit over recent decades, not just the past few years, but really recent decades. People identifying love of country with a kind of chauvinism or ethnocentrism, or even worse. Kevin, we all know that patriotism doesn't mean support for the policies of whatever the government happens to be. You and I have both been outspoken critics of our government under many administrations over the years. But it does mean allegiance to the principles of the country, in our case, to those great principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Robbie, for the introduction, for everything you've done to organize Fidelity Month. And thanks to Ryan and Anna for excellent comments. I'll piggyback on those. To the question, first of all, you're absolutely right. The decline in patriotism has accelerated over the last decade. In my lifetime, which is approximately half a century, we've seen a rebounding of patriotism following the Vietnam War that's often associated with the administration of Ronald Reagan. To your point about every policymaker having limitations, even those of us who are fans of President Reagan recognize limitations. But the point is that even those who disagreed with him politically often credited him for this revitalization of the belief in America, or as Anna might say, a belief in the American dream. This is good. It transcends Republican and Democrat. It transcends liberal and conservative. And in a lot of ways, not to put words in your mouth, Robbie, I think one of the successes of Fidelity Month over the years will be a revitalization of that concept that patriotism need not be associated with one political party or the other, but ought to be something that is shared across the political spectrum in spite of the political differences we have. But in order to get there, we have some work to do. And so before suggesting some homework for all of us, starting with myself, I'm going to put a little more meat on the problem. This issue of a decline in patriotism, a decline in a love for country, has many origins. It certainly has many symptoms. One of the symptoms, and I would argue one of the origins too, is that because you cannot love what you don't know, we simply don't teach American history and civics very well. Often now, when you go into the average civics or history classroom in an American high school, public or private, you're more likely than not to find a class that's oriented around political activism. And dare I say, not a surprise coming from the president of the Heritage Foundation, that it's political activism that's oriented toward one side of the political spectrum. It's not that political activism is bad inherently. It's that that's not the appropriate place for that to be happening, but because before we can decide what kind of political animals we want to be, which philosophy, ideology, candidates we want to be supporting, we first have to understand the foundational principles of this country. And I would argue, as an early American historian, I have to admit my bias, that there is no civil society, there is no nation state in the history of mankind for which it is more important for its people to understand its founding principles than the United States. Not because we're more important than any other people who's ever existed, but because of the nature of our country, how it was founded, leaning on Robbie's excellent opening comments. We don't do that well, and therefore it is very hard for us to resurrect, to revitalize this love of country. But I'm also a historian who focuses on the history of institutions, if you will. Institutions, as other social scientists would call as the mediating entities of civil society, a fancy way of saying it's where we hash out our differences or where we learn to live with our differences. And just to give, as I like to call it, a sidewalk example, when I was president of Wyoming Catholic College in Little Lander, Wyoming, town of 7,000 people, which made it the 11th largest city in Wyoming, I was a proud member of the Rotary Club, where I've been a member every place I've lived. I'm still a member of Rotary, although I'm a member of a Rotary Club in Texas, not in Washington, D.C., just because I still get back there a bit. But the point of the story is this. When you go into Lander, Wyoming, people might assume that Lander is politically conservative. In fact, as the people of Lander vote, it's split 50-50 between Republican and Democrat, because in addition to the college, which is sort of conservative, there are other entities there, institutions that are left of center politically. Guess where there was one place we all got along? At the Rotary Club. Because if any of you have been to a Rotary meeting, you have perhaps you're a member of Rotary. Not intending this to be a membership drive for Rotary, Robbie, but it's an important point. It is one example of a place, a mediating institution, where Americans of different backgrounds, different native tongues, different religions, different politics can get together and proclaim their love for country, regardless of who is president. Another place, not just in Lander, but in many other places around the country where politics don't matter, is Little League baseball fields. And in Lander, that's certainly true. I remember our son being on a baseball team with boys of families I knew. At the time of the ballot box, we were working for opposite ends, shall we say, but we were friends, not just for the purpose of that baseball game and winning and forming these young men, but because more important than our politics was our love for one another as friends, which is a way of saying that what bound us together was that we were fellow Americans. How we voted, how we kind of went about our lives didn't matter outside that space. What I'm arguing for is that one of the ways we can revitalize patriotism isn't just by flying the American flag, flying the Fidelity flag, by reciting the Declaration of Independence, which my family and I do every July 4th. It's a wonderful civic practice. I have a few remaining left of center friends who still do that. I would like to see more of them. But by remembering, perhaps the greatest act of patriotism is something we can do every day, which is to start, to initiate, or to rekindle friendships with people with whom we might disagree. And maybe our disagreements are on the most fundamental things to us. But nonetheless, for those of us who are Christians, we know that we're called to those friendships anyway. Social scientists describe this a little bit different. If you go to the Pew Organization's website or the Gallup polling organization's website, each year, actually a couple of times a year, each of those organizations does a poll on Americans' belief, their trust in institutions. And across the board, Americans' trust in institutions has declined precipitously. I was just looking at the historical data from Gallup earlier this morning, and this is a story that you know well, whether it's the Supreme Court or newspapers or Congress or large corporations. The decline in trust of those institutions has been significant. The military, thankfully, has enjoyed a rebounding, at least until the last couple of years. But keep in mind, there's some good news here, because in the mid-1970s, there was a decline in trust as well, largely as a result of how multiple presidential administrations prosecuted the Vietnam conflict. But that trust was revitalized because Americans began to understand on a day-to-day basis that the process of rebuilding institutions isn't something that happens on a real high level by the board of directors and by the chief executive officers. It's something that we do as individuals. So in other words, I'm more than anything arguing for all of us not to complicate this, that if we want people to believe in more in newspapers and the military and law enforcement and the Supreme Court, et cetera, that we have to go about our own daily lives in a way that's trustworthy, in a way that's faithful, starting, as Ryan would say, with a faith to God, continuing, as Anna has said so eloquently, with a faith to our families, nuclear families, extended, and friends. And I'm arguing ultimately, to get to the punchline here, Robbie, that a revitalization of patriotism, A revival of belief in this wonderful nation state is something that happens in our communities. And it happens in our communities because it's the easiest place for us to perform those duties. It's also the easiest place for us to overlook. And I will, if you permit me for just a moment, to give us a shot in the arm from a scholar who's very important to us here at the Heritage Foundation. He was a fellow in his day, Russell Kirk. He's got this wonderful essay, 10 Principles of Conservatism, that our interns here read each semester. Many of us here reread frequently. And this is the 8th point. I'll just read briefly from it to sort of put into perspective the importance of community for the United States and for us as individual Americans. This is what he says. Although Americans have been attached strongly to privacy and private rights, he had been talking about individualism as well, they also have been a people conspicuous for a successful spirit of community. In a genuine community, he continues, the decisions most directly affecting the lives of citizens are made locally and voluntarily. Some of those functions are carried out by local political bodies, others by private associations. So long as they are kept local and are marked by the general agreement of those affected, they constitute healthy community. My charge to us, it's a charge to me to begin with, because I often overlook this myself and my own community, my own neighborhood, is to remember that sometimes we need to turn off the national news. Sometimes we need to ignore national politics. The president of the Heritage Foundation is telling you that. Not permanently, but on a routine basis. And instead, pay attention, whether to the local news or even better, pay attention to your neighbor. My wife, who is my great accountability partner on practicing what I preach in this regard, reminds me that I need to carve out time in my busy schedule to know our neighbors. She does an excellent job of this. And my favorite neighbors are people who live a few houses down. We count on them when we're out of town and vice versa. Our kids are about the same age. We have almost monthly dinners with them. They are people who disagree with everything that the Heritage Foundation stands for, almost everything, with the exception of belief in family, belief in God, they're very faithful Jews, and a belief that regardless of our political differences, we ought to be the best of friends. For me, that summarizes how we can, on a daily basis, remember to be lovers of this country by being lovers of our fellow countrymen. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin. You've hit on so many important points that are so crucial to Fidelity Month. We really do intend for Fidelity Month to be a movement that is not only interreligious, interfaith, that is, people of all different traditions of faith, but also a movement that brings together people from across the ideological spectrum. Now, there are going to be certain people, of course, who, I assume as a matter of conscience, don't share our fundamental beliefs. Some may be on the right. Some will certainly be on the left. But there are plenty of people across the spectrum, right, left, center, non-categorizable, who do share our commitment to fidelity to God, to fidelity to spouses and families, to fidelity to country and communities. And we want to bring them together, irrespective of their religious beliefs, irrespective of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives. That's a big challenge these days. And, you know, in part, to be very candid, it's a challenge because it happens I'm the founder of Fidelity Month and I'm a conservative and have something of a reputation for being a conservative. But I want this to be an outreach to people who don't vote the way I vote, Kevin, or the way you vote. People who don't belong to the political party I belong to, but who share or every bit as committed as I am to the principles of Fidelity Month. Let me say to our participants joining us that we've got a Q&A button right there on your Zoom screen down there at the bottom in the black area. And please feel free to post your questions there because later on in our presentation, we will turn to Q&A. Before doing that, though, we're going to have some conversation among the four of us here on the panel. And I want to begin by returning to Ryan Anderson. Ryan, I want to raise a point that you touched on, but I want to give you an opportunity to expand on it a bit more. There are people who interpret the American founding and the American Constitution as relegating religion, the stuff about God, to the purely private domain, who believe that it is inappropriate and a threat to the Constitution of our democratic republic for people to bring religion or bring God into conversations about public affairs, public policy, the law. You and I, of course, take a very different view about that. Why don't you say a bit more in response to the idea that the fidelity to God part really shouldn't be part of the picture when it comes to public affairs, that religion really should be regarded as a purely private concern?
Sure. Great question. It's as you were doing the wind up to the question, I actually wasn't sure which direction you were going, because there are people both on the right and on the left who have that observation. The people on the right want to say, and that's what's bad about America, that the American founders privatized religion and they created a secular nation. And then there's some people on the left who say, that's what's good about America. The founders privatized religion and we should keep religion out of the public square. I think both of those critics are wrong. And I think properly understood, I mean, the nation is founded on a direct appeal to God, to human beings being created equal and being endowed not by the government, not by the king, not by the popular vote, but being endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So I think the only way you can actually understand the American founding is by engaged in some philosophical theology, an understanding of where do our rights come from, what's the foundation of our rights, what's the argument in favor of those. Which is why it's then very odd to me when you have someone like Rawls or Dworkin or other kind of theorists who want to then say, well, no, public reason has to, be devoid of God talk. And we're going to have, in the different conceptions of Rawlsian public reason, eventually we get to the overlapping consensus. And it just strikes me as odd why this is where he has his proviso that, I have to translate my views into public reason. But Peter Singer never needs to translate his views into reason that I could actually embrace. And it just strikes me that what the founders were doing is that, look, we are a pluralistic people. We come from a diversity of philosophical and theological backgrounds. At the time of the founding, it was largely Protestant and some Catholics, but different types of Protestants who didn't always agree. I mean, some of the deepest disagreements at the time of the settling of the nation were actually Protestant on Protestant disagreements, especially when you look at Massachusetts Bay Colony, the founding of Rhode Island, my own home state of Maryland being a Catholic colony, which, within a century, we can't hold public office, et cetera, et cetera. So a diversity of different sects of Christianity. Eventually, this gets expanded with Judaism, with Latter-day Saints, with Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. And in addition to all of those different theological traditions, we have a variety of philosophical traditions, right? We have philosophical utilitarians like Peter Singer. We have Kantians. We have pragmatists, right? Large American pragmatism tradition. My argument, and I think this is the argument of the founders, is that all of these views should be in the public square. This is also the argument of Father Richard John Newhouse, where he criticized what he referred to as the naked public square. We shouldn't be denuding the public of substantive, moral, philosophical, and theological traditions. Those are the well springs that we draw from when we're debating important issues of justice, the common good, rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of these voices should be welcomed in the public square. And then at the end of the day, each and every one of us needs to make a judgment about what we think is true, what we think is just, what we think is good. But we can't artificially rule certain voices out and say they're excluded. Another way of thinking about this is that all of us have metaphysical commitments, either explicit or implicit, right? No one has, metaphysical neutrality. Likewise, we all have moral commitments. And again, either explicit or implicit. My argument, and I think it's the argument of the founders, is that our metaphysical commitments should influence our moral commitments. Our moral commitments should influence our political commitments. And now it would be awfully odd if you say all of the secular metaphysical commitments and all of the secular moral commitments have a seat at the table, but none of the religious ones do. Right? I mean, that just strikes me as a violation of equality. It's a violation of the free exercise of religion, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's precisely what the founders were not doing when they established the country. And again, I think the history of our greatest social reform movements show this integration of faith and reason. I alluded to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. When he cites, it's Augustine to say that an unjust law is no law at all. It's Aquinas where he says, what is a just law? It's a man-made code that is in harmony with the natural law and the eternal law, right? The natural law being the law of God that's knowable by reason, the eternal law being, God himself. And you can think of this as the natural law participating in the eternal law, and then human beings deriving both to be sources for human law. That's America at her best. And it's what helped us get rid of the evil of slavery. It's what helped us get rid of segregation. And it can help us with some of the social reforms that we need here and now.
Ryan, you mentioned, among other thinkers, the late John Rawls, and I should probably say a word to our online participants about who he was and what he stood for. Professor Rawls was a professor at Harvard University in the second half of the 20th century and in the first decade of the 21st century. I think it's fair to say that he towered over political philosophy, academic political philosophy, for much of his adult lifetime. Much of the debate among contemporary political philosophers is a debate about John Rawls. And Rawls tried to wrestle with a central problem for any pluralistic system or any pluralistic society like ours, and that is, how do you live together when people have disagreements at the metaphysical level, when people have disagreements at the moral level, rooted in even deeper disagreements at the metaphysical level, including disagreements about religion. Rawls called that the fact of reasonable pluralism. This is the fact that where people are given freedom, especially spiritual freedom, religious freedom, they can be expected to come to different conclusions, not only about the minor, superficial, trivial things of life, but about the deep, important questions, the questions of meaning and value, the questions of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human rights, indeed, human destiny. And over his career, he did wrestle with these questions. His early work did seem to single out religion for a special exclusion as a ground for participation in or in the public debates or debates about public policy or for the making of public policy. But as you'll recall, Ryan, I'm sure later in his life, he he picked up on the very thing that you have mentioned at the end, and that is there would be something very odd about treating metaphysical commitments associated with religion differently, less well, as less eligible to participate in public affairs than metaphysical disagreements that are based on secular ideas. And so he adjusted his political theory famously in the 1990s, a book called Political Liberalism, to try to impose whatever strictures are to be imposed on metaphysical views, not only on religious ones, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, what have you, but also on secular ones, utilitarianism, Marxism, liberalism itself considered as what he called a comprehensive view. That is a view of the world, a worldview, a view of human life, of human dignity, of human nature. Now, whether the project in the end succeeded or failed is something I'll leave to each reader. And you and I, Ryan, have argued, of course, that it failed, but I think it was a noble, in a certain sense, heroic attempt to deal with the problem of pluralism, with the fact of reasonable pluralism, that people really will disagree about some fundamental things. But it's also true that throughout American history, as you say, Americans have been able to unite around, among other things, shared belief in God, despite their differences of religious denomination or tradition or commitment. I think we can do that again, and Fidelity Month, in part, is an expression of the belief that we can do that again. But I want to mention one thing before turning to Anna and Kevin, and that is last week I did an outreach on Twitter, now known as X, to our secular friends. Because we know that many Americans these days are secular. They are either atheists or agnostics or not committed to a particular religious tradition. Sometimes they're called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, who are religious people, obviously, but the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the people who check the box for no religious affiliation, or when asked what their religious affiliation, they say none, although they might regard themselves as believers in God, or they might regard themselves as spiritual but not religious, or what have you. And my outreach to secular people on behalf of Fidelity Month said this: we realize that you cannot join us on our first and primary commitment, fidelity to God, because you're a secular person. But to the extent that you can join us on our other principles, fidelity to in marriage, fidelity to spouses and families, and fidelity to country and communities, we want you to join with us as allies. Do whatever you can in conscience, and we will do whatever we can in conscience. We in Fidelity Month, even to those who can't join us fully, want to reach out a hand. We want to extend the hand of friendship. We want to do what Kevin does with his neighbors and friends who don't share his convictions. And we want to bridge the gap even to secular Americans. And I think we can do that. I don't think we compromise away any principle of Fidelity Month by that kind of outreach. Join us where you can in conscience, and where you can't, okay, we're going to have to just agree to disagree, and there will be points at which we're going to be wrestling, against each other, but that doesn't have to be on everything. And where we can unite, let's unite. Anna, I'm wondering if you yourself have any reflections on the diversity or the pluralism of Fidelity Month. Kevin put some emphasis on that in his own remarks, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it. You of course, in Cana Vox you've brought together, people from all the traditions. There's a large Muslim component to Fidelity Month, obviously a Jewish one, especially in the Orthodox Jewish community. The Latter-day Saints community has been very active in Fidelity Month. You've shown how it can be done.
Well, listening to you and Ryan, I was wondering if there's a third position that maybe wasn't articulated yet, and that's that when we come to the public square as people of faith, yes, we can articulate our theological and religious views, and we ought to be able to do that. But I think it's also incumbent on us to try to articulate or translate those values wherever we can into secular language, universal moral language, natural law, social science, data. Because of the unity between faith and reason, we can do that. We can translate a lot of what we believe into data, into ideas that are accessible to people who are not of our faith tradition. I mean, we've tried this at Cana Vox, and we're cashing in on the promise of natural law. It is absolutely true that there is a universal morality that most people can understand. And it turns out that if we don't tell people at Cana Vox to check their faith at the door. What we say is, look, it's wonderful that you are a committed Latter-day Saint member or a committed Jew. But here at Cana Vox, we're going to use another side of our brain. We're going to think about, okay, not why did God make marriage between a man and a woman, but why is there a kind of natural design to the human person that really speaks to the truth of marriage between man and woman? And is there a purpose to our natural design? And what does it mean to have a natural right? And do children have rights? And if so, what responsibilities do we have to children? And how do our obligations towards children and the most vulnerable make us have commitments to social structures that honor or take care of the most vulnerable? So it turns out that when we study and learn to articulate all those reasons in secular language, then you are better able to show up at the school board meeting or talk to the school librarian, not just why you're offended as a Catholic because of the drag queen, but why children actually need certain things, no matter what their religion is, that shouldn't be shocked or offended by somebody who's confusing them in that way. And you turn out to have a lot more street credibility in the eyes of atheists, liberals, and the like when you exert yourself to speak in that language. So it's not that I have, animosity towards religious lingo, but I think I have a little bit more of a tough love approach toward people who don't want to leave their religious lingo, and they insist always on speaking in those terms when I think it's really our duty to reach out more. So I would probably say that to start with, Robbie.
Thank you. Kevin, when you mentioned the late Russell Kirk, who was such a formidable contributor to the conservative movement in the United States, suddenly, for some reason, it made me think of Will Herberg and his great work, Protestant Catholic Jew. And that, in turn, Kevin, got me thinking about, of all people, my father. My father died in March of this year at age 98. When he was 18 years old, he was conscripted right out of high school. Hadn't finished high school yet, actually. They later sent his folks a diploma. But he was conscripted while still in high school and sent over to England and then over to Normandy. On his way over to Normandy, his ship, the Leopoldville, was struck by a German torpedo and sunk. Roughly half of the men, several hundred, 800, 900 aboard, died in the chill waters of the English Channel. He and about half the men were fished out, in his case by a British patrol boat. And since my father was uninjured, despite the trauma, was just brought on over to Normandy to participate in the Normandy campaign. But he was a Syrian, his parents immigrants from Syria, Syrian, Eastern Orthodox, Antiochian Christian. And he, alongside Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and other Americans and our allies, defeated what was the greatest war machine on earth, Hitler's Nazi war machine. And if you go, as I've gone myself, and as we've sent our students from the James Madison program, in some cases, over to Normandy to visit the cemeteries, you will see crosses, and those crosses, under those crosses are buried Christians of various denominations. You'll see stars of David. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews in that period fought to save the United States of America. They were equally patriots. Nothing in their religion made them any different from anybody else. Nothing made them more or less an American. I'm wondering if Herberg and that idea about the way in which Protestants and Catholics and Jews united to make modern America is something that resonates with you.
Extremely so. I can, as a historian, offer some other examples, although that one I think is the best that can be offered, in part because I once very briefly met your dad at an event when you were receiving one of your many honors. He was a great patriot, Robbie, and reminds me of so many older people that I've gotten to know. But to the heart of your question, yes. And I'm going to offer an example, not in a military sphere, obviously not to be dismissive toward those who serve our country. By the way, I do think that kind of thing, God forbid, if this republic ever finds itself needing to legitimately declare war again, I think the same thing is eminently possible. In spite of all of the reasons, legitimate reasons we have to think it might take us a few months or several months to get back to that. And the reason I want to offer a non-military example of the same kind of phenomenon is to give us some encouragement in our local communities. So give me 60 seconds to set this up. It was several years ago. Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas coast. We were living in Central Texas, not directly affected by the hurricane. And all of you will remember that 47 inches of rain later on the city of Houston and Beaumont, where many of my relatives lived and live, people's lives came to an end. Their livelihoods came to an end. And it was at the same time, that's one track of the story, is at the same time that in Texas, at least, the peak attempt by some Americans to eliminate statues and memorial plaques to various people in our history was at its apex. And my suggestion to my local city council, because I was trying to take my own advice about acting locally, was not to tear down the statue of the working class Confederate soldier from the 1860s. I get why that would be offensive to some Americans. But instead to erect a new statue of people, African Americans, Asian Americans, whites, Hispanics, many others, who got in their own boats. And by boats, I don't just mean fancy motorboats, but their $200 kayak that they bought at Academy Sports to go rescue other Americans. They didn't care about their politics. They didn't care about their religion. They didn't care about anything other than what they shared with this person. Obviously, their humanity, but also there was this higher calling that they felt as we did some interviews of them, that they were Americans, and that's all that mattered. And in a lot of ways, it's the same thing that I think has happened in these conflagrations that are military. God forbid that happens again down the road. I think it's possible. But maybe I'm taking this a step farther, Robbie, by saying I think we actually need to be very active, those of us for whom Fidelity Month is important, and be thinking about how we can erect memorials of this kind of thing that happens in emergency situations, whether in warfare or in this case, a natural disaster, because it will remind us that in spite of what we see on the national news, in spite of what just, almost a stone's throw from where I'm sitting at the US Capitol, it seems as if we have irreparable differences, that a majority of Americans, a majority of the time, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, and otherwise, will come together and help one another, help each other out.
Well, thank you, Kevin. We're now going to turn to Q&A with our participants, our online audience. And I want to thank everyone online for joining us today. This will be recorded and it will be posted. And I hope you'll call your friends who are unable to join us today, call their attention to it. Before doing that, though, I just want to make a couple of announcements. June 24th, we will be observing in Fidelity Month, in the Fidelity Month movement, a day of fasting and prayer for our nation. There's a long tradition of this, not only in our religious traditions, all of which do, of course, have fasting and prayer and special days for fasting and prayer, but in our political tradition. You'll recall President Washington, and especially President Lincoln, in the midst of that terrible carnage of the Civil War, calling for a day of fasting and prayer. So we're calling for a day of fasting and prayer as part of our rededicating ourselves to the principles of fidelity for June 24th. And if you're able and healthy enough to join us for the fast, please do. You can certainly join us in prayer, and please do that. Prayer for our families, prayer for our nation, prayer for us to be able to rededicate ourselves to the principles that once did and can again unite us and be our sources of strength. Also, I want to encourage everyone to visit our website at fidelitymonth.com. You'll get all sorts of information there about Fidelity Month, interesting articles and interviews. You will get suggestions there about how you can help with Fidelity Month, how you can host speakers or get involved in various ways in Fidelity Month activities, draft petitions to or requests for public officials to recognize Fidelity Month. We hope you will reach out to your religious leaders and other community leaders and others of influence to ask them to recognize Fidelity Month. We even have a little Fidelity Month shop. We don't make any money on it, but we do make available at cost merchandise such as our wonderful Fidelity Month flag, Fidelity Month caps, and Fidelity Month polo shirts and things like that, so that you can help us to get the message out. And free of charge, of course, we'd love for you to use our Fidelity Month logo, which is available at the fidelitymonth.com website on your social media accounts or anywhere else where you can use a logo. They're fitted in various ways for Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or what have you. And with that, I am going to turn to our Q&A, and I want to thank everyone who has sent in a question. I'll ask our panelists to keep answers brief so I can get to as many questions as possible in the time that is remaining. Here we have a question from Frank and Antonucci. Frank asks, and I'll direct this first to Ryan. Fidelity to God entails that human law, that is positive law, is answerable to natural law in the sense that natural law should inform the laws those who govern us make on our behalf. How might we articulate the correct relationship of dependence that exists between positive law, Frank here means the human law, the law in the statute books and so forth, the dependence that exists between positive law and natural law. Ryan, briefly?
Yeah, great question. This is exactly what MLK is getting at in that letter from the Birmingham jail. A positive law, a posited law, a human law, for it to be just, it needs to somehow be derived from the natural law. And there are two ways of doing this. It can either be derived more or less as a conclusion from premises. So the natural law says that killing an innocent human being is wrong. We have crimes against homicide, right? And you can see a very tight connection. But it might also be what Aquinas referred to as determinatio, where you have to make a determination. The natural law says we need vehicular safety. The natural law doesn't say whether to drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road. And so we need legislators to posit a law. We're going to drive on the right side of the road in this country. We might drive on the left side of the road when we're in the UK, something like that. Both sets of laws, the laws on homicide and the laws about which side of the road we're going to drive on, are connected to the natural law, but one as a very straightforward conclusion from principles, one as more of a determinatio. You have to determine how to implement the natural law. And I would say for all just laws, one way or the other, they're going to be derived from the natural law.
Thank you, Ryan. This one is for Dr. Roberts from an anonymous attendee. He says, Kevin, I've read that since the rise of social media, people are increasingly isolating themselves into ideological camps and cutting off those who think differently. Do you think social media is one of the primary causes of this? This deeply worries me because that inevitably leads to greater mutual ignorance, fear, and possibly even violence. What do you think the answer is to bridge that gap and get people to reconnect with people of different views? What are the simplest concrete steps we can take as individuals? And Kevin, I'll just add to that something I myself have noticed is that half the country seems to watch Fox News, read the Wall Street Journal editorial board and National Review, and the other half the country seems to watch MSNBC or CNN and read the New York Times and the Nation magazine or the New Republic. So everyone is being reinforced in what they already believe, and nobody's being challenged. What do we do about that?
Yeah, and we're still a growing proportion of the populace, Robbie, getting their news exclusively from TikTok, of all things. So to answer the person's question bluntly, yes, this is a huge problem. It's by every measure of thoughtful social scientists and journalists who observe this thing, social media has been, even though it's got good attributes and good uses, it has been a scourge as it relates to social cohesion, and it accentuates the very thing or aggravates the very thing Robbie has outlined. What are the concrete steps to solve it? Number one, routinely turn it off. Turn it off. Turn it off. If you're a parent or a grandparent, disallow usage of social media until your children or grandchildren are adults. It's actually that simple. Secondly, use it as a good tool. It is that, for obvious reasons, not just the very panel discussion we're having today, but the promotion of it was largely on social media. The panelists here use it well. Hopefully I use it well. Robbie might set the standard for using social media, and I compliment you often, Robbie, for this in a way that's civil, that's collegial, and a real practical tip for the person asking the question is to ask a question. Not a leading question, but to really use social media for the great purpose it can serve, which is to form a community and maybe use some of the tools within social media to create community. And finally, because I'll keep going, this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, being an educator and understanding seeing firsthand the ravages of social media on otherwise wonderful lives. In person, make connections with people live, and then continue those friendships on social media. It's a way of taking our local community, if you will, bringing it online, and perhaps expanding the scope of the friendships that we have. In other words, if we're mindful about this, I think that we can address it, but it is a social problem.
That's great, Kevin. Let me add just a recommendation, and that is have a look at the work of my very dear friend, Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist at New York University in the Stern Business School there. His recent writings and his presentations, which are available online, you can just Google him. His last name is H-A-I-D-T. H-A-I-D-T. It's pronounced Haidt, Jonathan Haidt. His writings and his media presentations make a very powerful case for keeping kids off social media until they are, for all intents and purposes, adults, 16, 17 years old. We already know enough to see the destructive impact on our young people of use of social media. I've myself noticed one. It's a small thing, but it's not insignificant in my own teaching. I've noticed that the attention spans of my students, even my best student, gosh, Princeton is full of brilliant students, and even the best of the best among these brilliant Princeton students. Over the last 10 years, I have seen a contraction in the attention span of students. And I suspect, I can't prove it, but I suspect that that has something to do with social media. Now, the next question, again from an anonymous attendee, is for Dr. Samuel. Anna, this attendee asks, very good question here, is there evidence that, normatively speaking, having a mother and father maximizes the chances for children to flourish? And does it discount or disparage single-parent families or other non-traditional families to hold up a mother and father as the standard we should be most encouraging and striving for? That's the question. I'll just add that, we do know of so many single parents, especially single mothers, but single fathers in some cases too, who struggle so hard and do such a fine job. And I certainly would not want to disparage them. And the questioner is asking, are we doing that when we hold up as the ideal the two-parent family?
Right. No, I mean, we have to nuance it a little bit, right? We all know families that, we live in a wounded world, right? And we all know families who, despite their very best efforts to live faithfully, to honor their marriages, life happens and divorce is sometimes inevitable. And we all know wonderful stepmothers and stepfathers and, people who step up to really try to repair the wounds that happen for children and for others in a marriage. And we should always applaud the efforts of all those families who really seek to repair what is wounded. But what I think we're seeing today is something else. A lot of individuals who just say, no, you don't need to have a mother or a father, or I want to put myself first, or I really want this alternative family form because I seek a child for my own personal fulfillment. And these are people who aren't doing hard things for kids, but they're asking children to do hard things for them, right? They're asking others to adjust to their desires and wants. And these trends are real. And there are statistics showing that there are individuals who see family in this way. And those are the views of family that I would disparage. But of course, I separate that from the individuals who are really trying to repair what's wounded. Now, there is a lot of data, especially after our wide social experiments with no-fault divorce and single motherhood. Up until the 2000s, social scientists were really united on the message that the gold standard for children was the intact mother-father family, biological family. Starting 2005 or so, we started hearing new voices saying, well, same-sex families could do just as well, and all these new hypotheses about alternative family structures that could possibly be just as good or even better. So we all know that marriage has been redefined, and right now we are in a state, we're kind of in a holding pattern. We're waiting for data to come in to see how children of stable same-sex households fare. Now, this is going to be a waiting game that's going to take quite a few decades, I think, because right now the percentage of stable, intact same-sex families is so small. About less than 1% of married Americans are same-sex, and even a smaller percentage of them have children. And not enough time has passed for social scientists to measure how that very small segment of society is going to fare, not just in the first 5 years of their life or the first 15 years of their life, but after 30, 40, 50 years. And so we really don't know yet. The jury is still out, but we have a lot of reason to believe that when children are severed from their biological mother through surrogacy, or through an egg donor, anonymous egg donor, and they don't know who their mother is, or when a child is conceived through an anonymous sperm donor, or just separated from their family at birth, we do know there is a lot of science that shows these children struggle. They struggle a lot. They have existential bewilderment. They have other problems, right? And so we should be very cautious about declaring victory, right? I think we have every reason to be very cautious about these new social experiments and to heed the past, heed the social science of the past. Some of the scholars I cited in the presentation, Bradford Wilcox, Mark Ignaris, Melissa Kearney recently, have the data that you're asking about. And there's also a website that I will type into the chat that you can look at with some of the data from about a decade ago too. And that has a neat website with interactive slides that you can see. But yeah, I think we do have enough data to believe that the mother-father family is the gold standard, and that whenever we cannot provide that, then we should encourage people to reach it as closely as possible. And we should not ever judge people, right? Individual cases, because we never know what a particular family is struggling with.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. Very sensitive and nuanced and balanced answer. Samuel Kinsey has a question, and this is a question that I think is a very good and important and certainly legitimate question. I find it deeply regrettable that it's a question that has to be asked today, because frankly, I am shocked in 2024, in my lifetime, to see open, blatant anti-Semitism in our country. I'm shocked. I've seen it on campus. I've seen it on my own campus. So here's the question. We have seen shocking acts and speeches of anti-Semitism and hatred of America, particularly in the pro-Palestinian student protests at universities and embassies. How can we respond to this? The particular challenge stands out to me that most of these most vocal advocates are uneducated and have no historical or moral perspective. How can we change people like this who seem actively to hate our country and its ideals? How do we encourage fidelity in response to this? Let me take a little crack at this myself, and then Kevin, perhaps you could weigh in as well. First, I want to reiterate how shocked I am personally to see anti-Semitism in blatant form in our country. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to see this ancient curse manifest itself so blatantly here. And I think it's very important for those of us who are Christian, and the Fidelity movement is Christian, Muslim, Jewish, all faiths. But I think for those of us who are Christian, who have our own terrible history, a stain on our conscience of anti-Semitism, including by officials speaking for the church, it's imperative that we stand in solidarity with our Jewish brothers and sisters against anti-Semitism at any form, any time, any place. So that's number one, and that seems to me an absolutely non-negotiable matter. It is important that we recognize that we Americans differ on lots of social policies, including foreign policy, including the politics of the Middle East. I myself am a supporter of the state of Israel. There are disputed questions, rights and wrongs of having to do with the government of the state of Israel. No government should be immune from criticism. Israelis themselves and Jewish people here in the United States and elsewhere don't hesitate to criticize Israeli governments. But it seems to me that there's a difference between legitimately recognizing the legitimacy of criticism of the government of Israel for its policies, including its policies toward Palestinians. Reasonable people of goodwill can debate those questions, and using complaints about the government's policies in Israel as a pretext for anti-Semitism, or to justify calls for the very destruction of the state of Israel or the genocide against the Jewish people. Again, this is not to say that there are not legitimate debates, including over the war in Gaza. I have my opinions about that. Other people have their opinions about that. But we mustn't ever allow our differences of opinion on these matters, as important as they are, to become pretexts for anti-Jewish hostility. I also don't want all Muslims to be tarred, or Muslims as such to be tarred with the brush of anti-Semitism. I still believe that the majority of our fellow Muslims or Muslim fellow citizens, whatever their particular views about the Middle East and the policy of the Israeli government and the war in Gaza and so forth might be, are not bearers of bigotry toward the Jewish people. I myself have dear, dear Muslim friends who I know bear no animosity in their hearts toward the Jewish people. And I want their voices to be amplified and overcome the voices of those. And they're not just Muslims. They're, anti-Semitism is a equal opportunity curse. It affects Christians as well as Muslims and everybody else. But I want the voices of those who are using the politics of the Middle East and the conflicts of the Middle East as pretext for anti-Semitism. I want those voices to be overwhelmed by the voices of reason and decency, those who believe in the equal dignity of each and every human being. When we think about something like the war in the Middle East, we do have to remember that every human life is equal in dignity and sanctity. That we should be committed to the principle of the sanctity of all human lives, the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Muslim. It doesn't matter whether you're Israeli or Palestinian. And we must never, whatever our identities are, whatever our allegiances are, must never forget that. And I think and trust that that's something that Christians, Jews, and Muslims can join in affirming. End of my sermon, Kevin, and now I'll toss it over to you.
Excellent sermon, Pastor George. Three things. There's bad news, there's terrible news, but there's also good news. The bad news, to Robbie's point, is that surprisingly, at least to me, anti-Semitism exists at the scale that it does in 2024. The terrible news is that worse than the existence of the anti-Semitism, and let's be honest, blunt, mostly by bi-coastal, college-educated white elites, the terrible news is the cowardice, word used not to be hyperbolic, but to be intentional, of college presidents, of policymakers in eradicating the problem. But the good news is, you ask a policy guy a policy question, you're going to get a policy answer. State legislatures need to defund universities where this is allowed by the president and the board of trustees, and Heritage supports congressional action if necessary. That, with very good reason, probably makes my friend Robbie a little nervous, because there needs to be a limiting principle on that. But this is how problematic this is. It really, I mean, what a way to come full circle in this great conversation, looking at this great threat to fidelity. But in other words, we have to be that bold in order to finally eliminate this from this otherwise noble society.
I think we've got it, Kevin. You're right. I think we've got a challenge here, as you know, and others on the panel know, and probably many people in the participating audience know. I'm a very strong believer in free speech in our general democratic Republican discourse, and also on campuses. I think that a profound, robust, sweeping commitment to free speech is essential to the truth-seeking mission of colleges and universities. And that means we have to tolerate some very awful speech. But I think we have to, in honoring free speech, even for those who say terrible, vile things, we have to avoid being hypocrites, and we have to avoid double standards. I think when the college presidents, Kevin, testified before Congress, the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT, and got themselves in terrible hot water. Two of them ended up losing their jobs, as you know, for giving a nuanced answer, let's call it, to the question of anti-Semitic speech on campus, calls for genocide against the Jews and so forth. As you know, they gave what is technically the legally correct answer. That's the constitutionally correct answer under the First Amendment. And although their universities happen to be private universities, they had committed themselves as universities to First Amendment standards and were legally bound by their commitments. I think what was wrong about the testimony of the three presidents was not that they gave the wrong answer in emphasizing the importance of free speech, is that it's rather that all three institutions were guilty of disrespecting free speech when the issue was something other than the rights and dignity of Jewish people. And that double standard, that hypocrisy, came back to bite them. We need a robust free speech, but it's got to be non-discriminatory. It's got to be even-handed. There can be no hypocrisy and no double standards. Anna, here I have a question for you from an anonymous attendee. Interesting question. How do you address the concern of parents for marrying within their faith communities? I think it must mean for children, about their children marrying within their faith communities. Or how do we raise our children as citizens so that they stay firm in their faith while being able to reach out to those who believe differently? Are you concerned about immigration? Anna, you, of course, are a child of immigrants. Are you concerned about immigration and all the cultural differences that could bring the American, all the cultural differences that could bring the American nation? I'm sorry, I misread the question. Do you see that as a hindrance to our unity? Okay, now, and I'm going to let you answer this question, but I'm going to set it up by saying we have always been a nation of immigrants. We prided ourselves in being a nation of immigrants. And because we're not a nation whose sources of unity and strength are blood and soil or throne or altar, we have been able to assimilate immigrants and have them become true and loyal and faithful and self-sacrificial Americans. So surely it seems to me that we don't want to give up on the power of our nation to bring the unum out of the pluribus, to bring the one out of the many. But I think you can appreciate the concern, the honest, legitimate concern behind the question. What do you say?
Well, first I'll say this is not an area of my expertise. I'm not a policy wonk on immigration. I'm not going to even go there. But I do think you're right about the assimilation and the education into the American way. Just drawing from my own personal experience, Robbie. When I got to when my parents had me in Houston, I was raised in a Spanish-speaking household. My mother didn't even speak English. My father was learning English in the early years of my life. And when they enrolled me at Thornwood Elementary School, the public school in Houston, the teachers asked, "Do you want her to go into the ESL program?" And my mother said, "Yeah, why not?" And my father said, "Absolutely not. Throw her in with the American kids and have her learn English." And in 2 months, I was speaking Spanish. I was speaking English. I wasn't spelling it that well, but I was speaking. I was assimilated very quickly. And I will also credit a lot of our neighbors and friends who loved Mexican food, the people at our church who really welcomed us into the community. My piano teacher, Mrs. Thelma Hearn, who also loved the Mexicans in our neighborhood and who she prided herself in having taught Jeb Bush piano when he was little. She took us to all of these Houston opera events, Gilbert and Sullivan Society meetings, and she dragged us along and taught us a lot about Texan culture, American culture. She was a real patriot. We learned so much more in those piano lessons than piano or music theory. We learned what it was to be an American. And talk about local community and what your neighbors can do for you. I would say that the process of assimilation depends a lot on what the Native Americans do, how the local church communities reach out. Aside from whatever else, the laws and policies are doing around us. So I am concerned about the process of assimilation. I think it can lead to disunity, but I'd rather have a hopeful attitude about it all. And then, yeah, I don't know, Robbie, if we have time for me to answer the other
Yeah,
part.
please do answer that first part of the question. That's a very sincere
Yes.
question, I'm sure.
Yes. So, I think we really have to expend a lot of energy. I have 6 children, ages 9 to 19, and I'm in the thick of this right now, right? Really trying to expend as much energy as I can with my husband in accompanying our children. You have to, I think, spend so much time as parents today recognizing that we are living in times of great challenge for people of faith. And we can no longer assume that our children are being raised in friendly environments to the faith. And you have to dedicate more time and resources to educating them about why you believe what you believe, not just what you believe, and not just the Bible says it's wrong or it's always been wrong, or Judaism forbids it, but why? The why. And I think the natural law why is really strong. Why? How do you explain this to a person who's not religious? We have to study this as well a lot ourselves, but teaching our children why we believe what we believe and being in step with all of the challenges they're facing year after year and talking to them a lot. I think a lot of the catechesis at home is just around the kitchen island or driving in the car, talking to them all the time. It really has to be a constant dialogue with our children so that they're learning how to interact in friendly ways that are also very, very faithful to their faith. So that by the time, they're starting to date, you're still with them, giving them advice. Maybe they're dating somebody who's not of your faith tradition. What can you learn from that situation, right? What are some of the pros and what are some of the cons of dating that atheist guy, right? If you are walking in step with them in friendship as the loving mentor and guide, and really encouraging them, I think, to date before they leave the home, before they go off to college, so that they learn while they're still living under your roof, then hopefully they will make wise decisions. But as we all know, we can do our very best as parents, and they still have that darn thing called free will.
We will.
And we can't blame ourselves for everything, right? We do the best we can, we pray hard, and we hope for the best.
Thank you, Anna. Final question, very briefly over to Ryan for this one. And Ryan, here, our anonymous attendee asks you to speak from the specific perspective of your Christian faith. And again, Fidelity Month is for people of all faiths, but specifically as a Christian, how can we calmly respond to those, especially in the younger generation, who dismiss our Christian faith because they connect Christianity with nationalism? You might want to say a word about nationalism, because that in some circles is a bad word and in some circles is a good word. But how do you respond to that question, Ryan?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot really hinges on what we mean by that word nationalism. If by nationalism you mean something like National Socialism, and you mean something like the Nazis, then yes, obviously that would be problematic. But if you mean what Yoram Hazony is promoting, whether you agree with Yoram or disagree, there's nothing evil or pernicious about this, right? You might think it's a good idea, a bad idea. You might think it's prudent or imprudent. But Yoram Hazony's book, The Virtue of Nationalism, has nothing to do with that. I mean, his basic point there is that nation state sovereignty is better than globalism. I mean, the people who speak of nationalism in that way are simply saying that nations should not cede their authority to international organizations like the EU or like the UN, and that sovereignty should reside in the nation, and therefore there's a virtue of nationalism as such. I mean, that's Yoram's point, as I remember the book. It came out, I don't know, 5 years or so ago. So again, a lot really hinges on how you understand what's predicating the question. I would say part of how I would answer the question, though, is leave aside the question about nationalism. How do you respond to a younger generation that's rejecting Christianity because of all of the perceived ills and evils of Christians or of the church or of political movements associated with Christians and the church? And my response to this is just give them a real history lesson. And I think the best one volume of this is Tom Holland's book, Dominion, where he just, I think it's over around 600 pages, and he starts in the Greco-Roman world, and he shows the transformation on the face of the earth because of Christian revelation. Yes, it's part of the natural law. Yes, human reason and principle can know it. Historically, the way that we actually got to know it was when the word became flesh. The way in which we had a revolution in how we view slavery and how we view slaves, how we view women, how we view sex, how we view the family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Holland is really good on just showing the way that the Christian, I think the subtitle of the book is like the Christian Revolution that remade the world. And my understanding is at the time that he wrote the book, he wasn't a believer. And I think he may now be somewhere on a path towards belief. So anyway, I mean, that's what I think a lot of young people rejecting Christianity today has to do with a bad understanding of what that historical record actually looks like. And then the second thought, it goes to what Anna had just said, is that a lot of people don't understand why the church teaches what she teaches, why the Bible reveals what it reveals. And here I do think there's a huge apologetic value to showing that faith and reason go together, that the natural law and the divine law, they don't contradict, they actually go hand in hand. The best of science supports the best of faith, the best of philosophy supports the best of theology. And, Robbie, you've done this in your own work, whether it was on embryo ethics, whether it was on marriage, whether it was on a variety of questions. And I think that's what we're going to have to do. I mean, some of the newer issues, I was about to say transgender ideology, but I guess you haven't directly tackled that in your own academic work. But, these are the sorts of things where you see the reasons why people reject the faith. It tends to be that They reject science. They claim that the Christian church is anti-science, it's anti-reason, it's against various minority populations. And I just think it's a matter of both helping with the history and then helping with the philosophy.
I can only say amen. I'm always inspired by that beautiful image with which the late Pope John Paul II, now Saint Pope John Paul II, opens his encyclical on faith and reason, Fides et Ratio. He says that faith and reason are like the two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. We really do need them both. We're in bad shape if we're relying exclusively on just one and not the other. Well, again, let me remind people to visit our fidelitymonth.com website and learn how you can be part of Fidelity Month and you can be a leader in the Fidelity Month movement. For those who would like to join us for our day of fasting and prayer, June 24th, we'll be fasting and praying across the nation for a restoration of and a rededication of ourselves as a people to the principles of fidelity. And again, those principles are fidelity to God, fidelity to spouses and families, fidelity to our country and communities. And I want to thank our wonderful panelists, Dr. Ryan Anderson, Dr. Anna Samuel, and Dr. Kevin Roberts. And I want to thank everyone who joined us online. Please be active in the Fidelity movement, act locally in the Fidelity movement, do everything you can to spread the word together. Let's make America faithful again. Thank you.